The squad car's red and blue lights painted my driveway in alternating colors as I stood there in my work clothes, still holding the chainsaw that had been running 30 seconds earlier. Officer Martinez stepped out, his hand resting casually on his belt, while my neighbor Dave Richardson stood on his pristine lawn with his arms crossed, wearing that smug expression I'd come to know too well over the past 18 months. "Sir, we got a call about destruction of property," Martinez said, his voice professional but not unfriendly. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" I set the chainsaw down carefully, my hand steady despite the rage burning in my chest. At 43, I'd learned to control my temper, but Dave Richardson had been testing that control for months now. The man had called the cops on me for everything, from parking my work truck on my own driveway to having a barbecue that went past 9 p.m. This time, though, this time was different. "I was trimming trees on my property, officer," I said, gesturing toward the massive oak that straddled the property line. Half its branches hung over my garage, dropping leaves and acorns that had been clogging my gutters for 3 years running. "That's not your tree," Dave called out from his lawn, his voice carrying that particular tone of righteous indignation that made my jaw clench. "That tree is clearly on my side of the property line, and you're trespassing." Martinez looked between us, then at the tree, then back at me. "You have any documentation showing where your property line runs, Mr. Mike Costello?" I said, wiping sawdust off my flannel shirt. "And yeah, I've got documentation. Give me 5 minutes." Dave's smirk widened. "Good luck with that, Mike. I had my property surveyed last month. That tree is mine, and you just committed a felony." The word felony hung in the air like a challenge. My wife Sarah would be home from her nursing shift in an hour, and the last thing I wanted was to explain why there was a police report filed against her husband, again. This was the 4th time Dave had called the cops on me since he'd moved in next door, and each incident had been more ridiculous than the last. I walked toward my house, my work boots crunching on the fallen oak leaves that Dave claimed I had no right to clean up. The irony wasn't lost on me that a man who'd made his money in real estate development was about to learn something about property rights from a guy who installed drywall for a living. The deed was in the fireproof safe in my bedroom closet, right where it had been since we bought the house 12 years ago. 12 years of mortgage payments, 12 years of fixing everything that broke, 12 years of turning a rundown colonial into something Sarah and I could be proud of. And now some newcomer with too much money and too little sense thought he could intimidate me into submission. I pulled out the folder containing all our property documents, including the survey we'd had done when we first bought the place. The property line ran exactly where I'd always known it ran, 3 feet into what Dave considered his precious lawn, and right through the trunk of that oak tree. When I walked back outside, I noticed Dave had moved closer to Officer Martinez, his voice low and confidential, probably spinning some story about the dangerous neighbor who'd been harassing him. I'd heard variations of it before, usually from Sarah, who'd run into Dave's wife Linda at the grocery store. "Here's my deed," I said, handing the document to Martinez, "and here's the survey from 2011 when we bought the house." Martinez studied the papers carefully, occasionally glancing up at the yard to orient himself. Dave's confident expression began to waver as the officer traced the property line with his finger, comparing it to the actual landscape. "Mr. Richardson," Martinez called out, "could you come over here for a minute?" Dave approached with less swagger than before, but still carrying himself like a man who'd never been wrong about anything important. At 55, he was one of those guys who'd made his money early and spent the rest of his time telling everyone else how to live their lives. Retired from development work, he'd moved to our middle-class neighborhood because it was up and coming, which really meant he'd gotten a deal on a house he could flip or tear down. "According to this survey, Mr. Castellano is correct," Martinez said, showing Dave the documents. "The property line runs right through this tree. Looks like you both have claim to it." The color drained from Dave's face as he stared at the papers. I watched him process the information, seeing the exact moment he realized he'd been wrong. Not just wrong, spectacularly, publicly wrong, in front of a police officer he'd called himself. "That can't be right," Dave said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I had a survey done last month. It showed—" "Do you have those documents with you?" Martinez asked. Dave's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. They're at the house. I'd have to get them." "I'll wait," I said, crossing my arms. "I'd like to see what your survey says." The next 10 minutes were the longest of Dave Richardson's life. He trudged back to his house with all the enthusiasm of a man walking to his own execution, while Martinez and I made small talk about the weather and the state of the local baseball team. The officer was probably in his early 30s, Hispanic, with the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he'd seen enough neighborhood disputes to know how they usually played out. "These property line disputes get pretty heated sometimes," Martinez said, conversationally. "Usually comes down to people making assumptions instead of checking the facts." "Yeah, well, some people are better at making assumptions than others," I replied, watching Dave's front door. When Dave emerged from his house, he wasn't carrying any papers. His face had gone from pale to red, the kind of red that suggested he'd found his survey and it had confirmed exactly what mine had shown. He walked back across the yard like a man heading to his own funeral. There seems to be some confusion with my paperwork," Dave said, avoiding eye contact with both Martinez and me. "Maybe I should have it re-examined." Martinez nodded diplomatically. "That might be a good idea. In the meantime, it looks like Mr. Castellano was within his rights to trim branches on his side of the tree. No crime committed here." I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt satisfied to watch Dave Richardson eat crow in front of a police officer he'd called to arrest me. Instead, I felt something closer to pity. The man had been so certain of his righteousness, so convinced that his money and his confidence gave him the authority to control his neighbors, that he'd never bothered to check the basic facts. "Appreciate you coming out, officer," I said, shaking Martinez's hand. "Sorry for the trouble." "No trouble at all. Part of the job." Martinez looked at Dave. "Mr. Richardson, I'd suggest getting that survey situation cleared up, and maybe having a conversation with your neighbors before calling us next time. These disputes usually work out better when people talk to each other first." Dave mumbled something that might have been agreement and started walking back toward his house. But I wasn't ready to let him go just yet. "Dave," I called out. He stopped, but didn't turn around. "You know, in the 12 years I've lived here, I've never once called the cops on a neighbor. Not even when the college kids 3 houses down were throwing parties until 3 a.m. every weekend. Not even when Mrs. Patterson's dog was getting into my garbage for 6 months straight." Now he turned around, his face still red, but with something else mixed in. Maybe shame, maybe anger, hard to tell with a guy like Dave. "I try to be a good neighbor," I continued. "I keep my yard clean, I don't play music too loud, I help people when they need it. But I don't respond well to being bullied. And I especially don't respond well to being threatened with criminal charges for maintaining my own property." Dave opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it again. Martinez had gotten back in his squad car, but hadn't driven away yet, probably waiting to see if this was going to escalate into something that required more intervention. "Look," I said, taking a step closer to Dave, "we're neighbors. We don't have to be friends, but we don't have to be enemies either. But if you call the cops on me one more time without having your facts straight, if you try to intimidate my wife when I'm not home, if you keep treating this neighborhood like your personal kingdom, then you and I are going to have a very different kind of conversation." The threat was implicit but clear. Dave was bigger than me by maybe 20 pounds, but I'd been working construction for 20 years, and my hands showed it. More importantly, I'd been pushed as far as I was willing to be pushed. Some men spend their whole lives avoiding confrontation, but I wasn't one of them. Not when it came to my home and my family. I, I didn't realize about the property line, Dave said finally. The survey I had done was incomplete. I'll get it corrected. It was as close to an apology as I was going to get, and probably more than I'd expected. I nodded and picked up my chainsaw. Fair enough, I said. And Dave, the branches that hang over my garage are going to get trimmed whether you like it or not. That's not a threat, that's just maintenance. Martinez pulled away with a small wave, leaving Dave and me standing in our respective driveways, the property line between us suddenly very clear. Dave went inside without another word, and I fired up the chainsaw to finish what I'd started. But as I worked, cutting away the dead branches that had been bothering me for years, I kept thinking about the look on Dave's face when he'd realized he was wrong. There was something almost tragic about a man so invested in being right that he couldn't handle being corrected. Sarah always said I was too hard on people like Dave, that his type of arrogance usually covered up some deeper insecurity. Maybe she was right, but I'd grown up in a neighborhood where you settled disputes with words first and fists if necessary. The idea of calling the police every time you had a disagreement with someone was foreign to me. I was almost finished with the trimming when Sarah's Honda pulled into the driveway. She got out in her scrubs, looking tired the way she always did after a 12-hour shift at the hospital, but she managed a smile when she saw me. "How was your day off?" she asked, kissing me on the cheek. Then she noticed the pile of cut branches and the police tape still fluttering from Martinez's car door. "What happened here?" "Dave called the cops on me again," I said, setting down the chainsaw. "Thought I was cutting down his tree." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, resignation. "Please tell me you didn't get arrested?" "Nope. Turned out I was right and he was wrong. Showed the officer our deed and survey. Dave didn't have his facts straight." "Shocking," Sarah said dryly. She'd never liked Dave Richardson, not since the first week he'd moved in and complained about our dog barking at 6 in the morning. Never mind that, Rusty had been getting up at 6 for 8 years and had never bothered any of our other neighbors. "He apologized," I added. "Sort of." "Really?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Dave Richardson apologized?" "He admitted he was wrong about the property line. It's progress." Sarah looked skeptical, but she didn't push it. She'd learned over 17 years of marriage that I handled conflict differently than she did, and that my methods, while sometimes more direct, usually got results. "Well, I'm glad you didn't get arrested," she said, "and I'm glad you finally got those branches down. Maybe now the gutters won't clog up every time it rains." That evening, as we sat on our back deck watching the sunset behind the oak tree that was apparently half mine and half Dave's, I found myself thinking about property lines and what they really meant. On paper, they were just legal boundaries drawn by surveyors and recorded in courthouse documents. But in reality, they represented something more fundamental. The idea that a man should be able to control his own space, make his own decisions, and not have to justify himself to anyone who thought they knew better. I'd bought this house when I was 31, fresh out of a bad divorce and looking for a new start. Sarah and I had been dating for 2 years, and buying a house together felt like a declaration of intent, a way of saying that we were building something permanent. The mortgage had been a stretch at first, especially on my construction worker's salary, but we'd made it work. We'd painted every room, replaced the furnace, remodeled the kitchen, and turned the basement into a workshop where I could build furniture and fix things that broke. This house represented 12 years of labor, both physical and financial. Every mortgage payment, every repair, every improvement had been an investment in our future. And now Dave Richardson, who'd been here less than 2 years, thought he could dictate how I maintained my property. The next morning was Saturday, and I was in the garage organizing my tools when I heard voices from the Richardsons' backyard. Dave was talking to someone, his voice carrying the animated tone of a man trying to convince someone of something. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm was familiar. It was the same tone he'd used with the police officer yesterday, confident and slightly condescending. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked to the back corner of my yard where I could see over the fence. Dave was standing next to the oak tree with a younger man in a polo shirt who was holding a clipboard and what looked like surveying equipment. They were both looking up at the branches I'd trimmed, and Dave was gesturing emphatically. The young man, probably a surveyor Dave had hired to double-check the property line, was nodding politely but didn't seem particularly interested in Dave's explanation. He set up his equipment and began taking measurements, working methodically around the base of the tree. I went back to my garage and tried to focus on organizing my socket wrenches, but I kept glancing toward the backyard. Part of me was curious about what the new survey would show, but a bigger part of me was annoyed that Dave was still trying to prove me wrong even after yesterday's embarrassment. About an hour later, I heard Dave's voice again, but this time it sounded different, less confident, more strained. I walked back to the fence and saw the surveyor packing up his equipment while Dave stood there with his arms crossed, staring at the tree. "Problem solved?" I called out over the fence. Dave looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The survey confirms your documents," he said, after a long pause. "The property line runs through the tree trunk, just like you said." I nodded, but didn't say anything. There wasn't really anything to say. I'd been right, he'd been wrong, and now we both knew it officially. "I owe you an apology," Dave continued, his voice barely carrying across the yard. "I should have checked my facts before calling the police." It was a real apology this time, not the half-hearted admission he'd given yesterday. I climbed over the fence, something I never would have done a week ago, and walked over to where he was standing. "Apology accepted," I said. "But Dave, this can't happen again. I don't mind being a good neighbor, but I won't be pushed around in my own yard." Dave nodded, looking older than his 55 years. "I know. I guess I got used to being in charge when I was in development. Hard habit to break." It was the first time Dave had shown any self-awareness about his behavior, and it caught me off guard. I'd been prepared for another argument, not an honest conversation about personal flaws. "Look," I said, "I get that you're used to running things, but this is a neighborhood, not a development project. People here have been living their lives just fine without someone telling them how to do it." "You're right," Dave said. He looked up at the oak tree, its remaining branches swaying in the morning breeze. "I hired that surveyor because I was sure you were wrong. I couldn't believe that someone would know their property boundaries better than I did." "Why?" I asked. "Because I'm a construction worker and you're a developer?" Dave's face reddened. "Maybe. Yeah, probably. That's not fair, is it?" "No, it's not," I said. "But at least you're admitting it." We stood there for a moment, two middle-aged men looking up at a tree that belonged to both of us, and neither of us, depending on how you wanted to think about it. The morning was getting warm, and Sarah would be expecting me to mow the lawn before it got too hot. "Dave," I said finally, "I'm going to give you some free advice, neighbor to neighbor. The people on this street have been here a long time. We look out for each other. We help when someone needs it, and we mind our own business. But we don't respond well to being told what to do by someone who just moved in. If you want to be part of this neighborhood, you need to act like a neighbor, not a landlord." Dave was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll try to do better." "That's all anyone can ask," I said, and headed back toward my own yard. But as I climbed over the fence, Dave called out again. "Mike, that surveyor said the tree is probably diseased. The branches you cut off were dead, but there might be more problems. We might want to think about having it taken down before it falls on one of our houses." I stopped and looked back at the tree. It was massive, probably 80 years old, with a trunk so wide that Sarah and I together couldn't wrap our arms around it. But Dave was right. Some of the branches higher up looked brown and brittle, and there were patches of bark that had fallen away to reveal dead wood underneath. "You thinking about splitting the cost?" I asked. "If you're willing," Dave said. "It's going to be expensive, and it affects both our properties." It was a reasonable suggestion, and more importantly, it was the kind of thing neighbors did for each other. Split the cost of shared problems, work together to solve issues that affected the whole street. "Let me get a couple estimates," I said. "I know some tree guys from work. We'll figure it out." Dave smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since he'd moved in. "Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it." Walking back to my garage, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between Dave and me. The property line dispute hadn't just been about trees and boundaries. It had been about respect and authority and the question of who got to make decisions. By standing up for myself, by refusing to be intimidated, and by having the documentation to back up my position, I'd established that I wasn't going to be pushed around. But more than that, I'd given Dave an opportunity to back down with dignity. Instead of humiliating him or rubbing his face in his mistake, I'd let him apologize and find a way to contribute positively to solving our shared problems. It was the difference between winning a fight and building a relationship. Sarah came out as I was starting up the lawnmower, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the ratty t-shirt and shorts she used for weekend yard work. "How's the neighborhood peace treaty going?" she asked, having to raise her voice over the mower engine. I shut off the mower. "Better than expected. Dave apologized and we're going to split the cost of taking down the tree." "Really?" Sarah looked genuinely surprised. "That's progress. What changed?" "He hired another surveyor to double-check the property line," I said. "When it confirmed that I was right, I think it finally sunk in that he'd been the problem all along." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Linda mentioned at the grocery store that Dave's been having a hard time adjusting to retirement. Apparently, he's used to being in charge of big projects, and now he doesn't have anything to manage except his own yard." That explained a lot. Dave Richardson was one of those men who defined themselves through their work, and without the structure and authority that came with his job, he'd been trying to create that same sense of control in his personal life. The problem was that neighborhoods didn't work like construction sites. You couldn't just show up and start giving orders. "Maybe now he'll find a hobby that doesn't involve calling the police on his neighbors," I said. "Maybe," Sarah agreed, "but I'm proud of you for handling it the way you did. You stood your ground without escalating things unnecessarily." That meant something coming from Sarah. She'd grown up in a house where her father solved every problem by yelling louder than everyone else, and she'd made it clear from the beginning of our relationship that she wouldn't tolerate that kind of behavior. Over the years, I'd learned to channel my anger into more productive directions, to fight for what mattered without becoming the kind of man who picked fights just to prove he could win them. The rest of the weekend passed quietly. Dave and I waved to each other when we were both outside, but we didn't have any long conversations. It would take time to build a real neighborly relationship, and I wasn't going to rush it. Trust had to be earned, and Dave had a lot of ground to make up. On Monday morning, I was loading my tools into my truck when Dave came outside to get his newspaper. We nodded to each other, and he started to turn away, but then seemed to think better of it. "Mike," he called out, "I got those estimates for the tree removal. 3 different companies, all pretty much in the same range. Want to take a look?" I walked over and reviewed the paperwork he handed me. The estimates were reasonable, and all 3 companies had good reputations from what I knew. More importantly, Dave had done the legwork without being asked, which suggested he was serious about being a better neighbor. "This one's good," I said, pointing to the middle estimate. "I've worked with their crew before. They're professional, and they clean up after themselves." "Should I call them and set up a time?" Dave asked. "Yeah, but make sure they know it's a shared tree on a property line. Sometimes that affects their insurance coverage." Dave made a note on the estimate sheet. "Will do. And Mike, thanks for not making this harder than it had to be. I know I haven't been the easiest neighbor to deal with." It was another small step toward normalcy, another indication that Dave was genuinely trying to change his approach. I appreciated the effort, even if I wasn't ready to forget 18 months of harassment and police calls. "We all make mistakes," I said. "What matters is what we do about them." Driving to work that morning, I found myself thinking about the strange way conflicts could bring people together if they were handled right. Dave and I would probably never be best friends, but we might actually become decent neighbors. The key had been refusing to be intimidated while still leaving room for him to solve the problem. It reminded me of something my father had told me when I was younger and getting into too many fights at school. The point isn't to prove you're tougher than the other guy, he'd said. The point is to make sure he knows you can't be pushed around. Once that's established, you can usually find a way to get along. At the time, I'd thought he was talking about playground politics. But 25 years later, I was beginning to understand that the same principle applied to most of the conflicts in adult life. Whether it was dealing with a difficult neighbor, standing up to an unreasonable boss, or navigating family disputes, the key was finding the balance between being strong enough to defend yourself and flexible enough to find solutions that worked for everyone. The tree came down the following Saturday. Dave and I both took the day off to supervise the work, and we ended up spending most of the morning talking while the crew worked. It turned out we had more in common than either of us had expected. We'd both grown up in working-class families, both served in the military, both struggled with the transition from active careers to more settled domestic life. "I think I owe you more than an apology," Dave said, as we watched the crew load the last of the oak branches into their truck. "I think I owe you an explanation." I didn't say anything, just waited for him to continue. "When I retired, Linda and I downsized from our big house in the suburbs. I thought moving to a smaller neighborhood would be simpler, more relaxed, but I guess I brought all my bad habits with me." "What kind of bad habits?" I asked. "Control issues," Dave said with a rueful laugh. "In development work, everything runs on schedules and specifications. You tell people what to do, they do it, and the project gets completed on time and on budget. I guess I thought neighborhoods worked the same way." "But they don't," I said. "No, they don't. Neighborhoods are more like families, I guess. Complicated and messy and full of people who have their own ideas about how things should work." It was a surprisingly insightful observation from a man I'd written off as simply arrogant. Dave Richardson wasn't just a control freak. He was a man struggling to redefine himself after a lifetime of structured professional success. "The thing is," I said, "most of us on this street have been here a long time. We've figured out how to coexist without a lot of rules and regulations. When someone new moves in and starts trying to change things, it makes people defensive." "I get that now," Dave said. "I should have spent more time observing and less time trying to improve everything." The tree removal crew finished their work and drove away, leaving Dave and me standing in our respective yards with a clear view of each other for the first time since he'd moved in. Without the massive oak tree between us, the property line seemed less important, more like an arbitrary line on a map than a meaningful boundary. "You know what's funny?" Dave said, looking at the empty space where the tree had been. "I was so worried about that tree belonging to me that I never stopped to think about whether I actually wanted it." "Did you?" I asked. "Not really," he admitted. "It was old and messy and probably dangerous. But it was the principle of the thing, you know? I thought someone was trying to take something that was mine. And I thought someone was trying to stop me from maintaining my own property," I said. "Funny how two people can look at the same situation and see completely different problems." Dave nodded. "Maybe that's the real issue. We were both so focused on being right that we forgot to ask whether being right was actually important." It was getting late, and Sarah would be expecting me for dinner soon. But before I went inside, there was one more thing I wanted to say to Dave. "For what it's worth," I said, "I think you'll like this neighborhood once you get used to it. People here look out for each other. It's not perfect, but it's a good place to live if you're willing to be part of the community instead of trying to run it." Dave smiled. "I'd like that, being part of something instead of being in charge of it." "It's different," I agreed, "but it's not so bad." That evening, Sarah and I sat on our back deck in the exact spot where the oak tree had cast its shade for probably 50 years before we'd moved in. The yard looked strange and empty, but also full of possibilities. Maybe we'd plant a garden where the tree had been, or build a shed, or just enjoy having more sunlight. "So, how does it feel to win?" Sarah asked, handing me a beer. I thought about the question for a moment. "I'm not sure I won anything," I said finally. "I mean, I was right about the property line, and Dave was wrong. But calling that a victory seems too simple. What would you call it then? Resolution, maybe? Or just clarity? We both know where we stand now." Sarah curled up next to me on the porch swing we'd built together 3 summers ago. "Think he'll actually change?" "Maybe," I said. "He seems to understand what he was doing wrong. Whether he can actually change his behavior is a different question." "Well, at least he won't be calling the police on you anymore." "God, I hope not," I said, laughing. "Officer Martinez is probably tired of mediating our disputes." "He seemed nice enough," Sarah said. "Professional, but not condescending. Some cops would have just told you both to work it out yourselves." "Yeah, he handled it well. Checked the facts, stayed neutral, de-escalated the situation. Everything you want in a police officer." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset behind our neighbor's house. In the distance, we could hear the sounds of suburban evening life. Kids playing in someone's backyard, a lawnmower running, someone grilling dinner. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the soundtrack of a neighborhood where people generally got along. "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said eventually. "What's that?" "How easy it would have been for this whole thing to go differently. If I'd lost my temper when the cops showed up, or if Dave had doubled down on his position even after seeing my survey, or if we'd both decided to be stubborn about it." "But that's not what happened," Sarah pointed out. "No, but it could have. And then we'd be stuck living next to each other for the next 20 years, both convinced the other guy was an asshole. Instead of just being convinced for the first 2 years." "Exactly," I said, grinning. "Progress." The following weeks established a new normal in our neighborhood dynamic. Dave and I weren't exactly friends, but we were no longer adversaries. We waved when we saw each other, made small talk about the weather and local sports teams, and generally coexisted without drama. It was what neighboring should be: polite, respectful, and largely unobtrusive. More importantly, Dave seemed to be finding his place in the broader neighborhood community. I saw him talking to other neighbors, helping Mrs. Patterson with her groceries, even joining the informal Saturday morning basketball game that rotated between various driveways on our street. He was learning to be part of something rather than trying to control it. The space where the oak tree had been became a small garden that Sarah and I planted together. Nothing fancy, just some tomatoes and peppers and herbs, but it gave us a shared project and a reason to spend more time in the backyard. Sometimes Dave would comment on how the plants were coming along or offer advice about pest control, and gradually these brief conversations began to feel normal rather than awkward. One evening in late summer, about 3 months after the tree incident, I was watering the garden when Dave came outside to check his mail. Instead of just waving and going back inside, he walked over to the fence. "Mike," he said, "Linda and I are having a barbecue next weekend for my birthday. Nothing fancy, just some neighbors and a few friends. You and Sarah are welcome to join us if you're free." It was the first time Dave had invited us to anything, and the gesture felt significant. Not because I was eager to attend a Richardson family barbecue, but because it represented a genuine attempt to build a neighborly relationship. "That sounds nice," I said. "Let me check with Sarah, but I think we're free Saturday." "Great," Dave said. "And Mike, thanks for giving me a chance to get this right. I know I didn't make the best first impression." "We all get second chances," I said. "That's what neighbors do." The barbecue turned out to be more enjoyable than I'd expected. Dave was a decent cook, and Linda was friendlier than I'd remembered from our previous interactions. They'd invited about 20 people, mostly neighbors from our street and a few others from the surrounding area, and the atmosphere was relaxed and welcoming. What struck me most was how different Dave seemed in this context. Instead of trying to manage everything and everyone, he was content to grill burgers and let conversations develop naturally. He asked people about their families and their work, listened more than he talked, and generally acted like someone who was interested in getting to know his community rather than running it. "He's really changed," Sarah said quietly, as we stood together near the back fence, watching Dave flip burgers while talking to our neighbor Tom about baseball. "Yeah, he has," I agreed. "Makes me wonder what he was like before he moved here. Whether the control issues were always there, or if they developed when he lost his professional identity." "Probably some of both," Sarah said. "But the important thing is that he recognized the problem and did something about it." Later that evening, as the party was winding down and people were starting to head home, Dave approached me while I was helping Linda clear plates from the patio table. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, "for how you handled that whole property line situation. You could have made me look like an idiot in front of the police officer, but you didn't." "What would have been the point?" I said. "We still would have had to live next to each other." "That's exactly what I mean," Dave said. "You were thinking about the long term, not just winning the argument. I learned something from that." "What did you learn?" "That being right isn't always the same as being smart, and that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to give the other person room to save face." It was a sophisticated understanding of conflict resolution, especially coming from someone who'd approached our dispute like a zero-sum game. Dave Richardson had genuinely grown as a person over the past few months, and that growth had made him not just a better neighbor, but probably a better husband and friend as well. Driving home from work a few days later, I found myself reflecting on the whole experience and what it had taught me about masculinity, authority, and community. At 43, I'd reached an age where I understood that most conflicts weren't really about the surface issues that sparked them. The property line dispute hadn't been about trees or surveys or even money. It had been about respect, identity, and the question of who got to make decisions in our shared space. For Dave, calling the police had been an attempt to use external authority to validate his position when he couldn't establish that authority through persuasion or community standing. For me, refusing to be intimidated and producing the property documents had been a way of asserting that I wouldn't be pushed around in my own neighborhood, especially not by someone who'd been here a fraction of the time I had. But the real lesson hadn't been about winning or losing. It had been about finding a way to resolve conflict that left both parties with their dignity intact and opened the door for a better relationship going forward. In my father's generation, this kind of dispute might have ended with someone getting punched in the mouth. In my generation, it was more likely to end with lawyers and restraining orders. But somehow, Dave and I had found a middle path that acknowledged the legitimate concerns on both sides while establishing clear boundaries for future interactions. The autumn months brought new challenges that tested our evolving neighborly relationship. In October, a massive storm knocked down power lines throughout our area, leaving most of the street without electricity for 3 days. Dave had a generator that he'd bought for his previous house, and without being asked, he ran extension cords to several neighbors' houses so people could keep their refrigerators running and charge their phones. When my truck wouldn't start on the second morning of the outage, Dave offered to let me borrow his car to get to work. It was the kind of gesture that went beyond mere politeness into genuine neighborliness, and it made me realize how far our relationship had come from those tense early days. "You don't have to do that," I told him as he handed me his keys. "I can call someone to jump the battery." "It's no problem," Dave said. "Linda's not working today, and we don't have anywhere we need to be. Besides, neighbors help neighbors, right?" It was a small thing, but it represented a complete reversal in how Dave approached relationships with the people around him. Instead of looking for ways to assert control or establish dominance, he was looking for ways to contribute to the community's well-being. Sarah noticed the change too. "Remember when you used to complain that Dave was the worst neighbor we'd ever had?" she said one evening as we watched him help Mrs. Patterson clear fallen branches from her driveway. "I may have been premature in that assessment," I admitted. "Think you learned anything from the whole experience?" I considered the question carefully. I learned that people can change if they have the right motivation. And I learned that sometimes the best way to deal with a difficult person is to give them a chance to be better than they've been. That's very philosophical of you, Sarah said with a smile. Yeah, well, I'm getting old. Supposed to be wise or something. 43 isn't old, Mike. Old enough to know that holding grudges is exhausting, I said, and old enough to appreciate it when someone makes a genuine effort to improve. By the time winter arrived, Dave and I had settled into a comfortable routine of casual cooperation. We borrowed tools from each other, shared information about contractors and service providers, and generally acted like the kind of neighbors we both should have been from the beginning. It wasn't a deep friendship, but it was a functional relationship, built on mutual respect and shared investment in the community. The real test came in February when Linda Richardson was diagnosed with breast cancer. Dave knocked on our door on a Tuesday evening, looking older and more frightened than I'd ever seen him. Sarah invited him in for coffee, and he spent an hour at our kitchen table talking about treatment options and prognosis and the overwhelming uncertainty of facing a life-threatening illness. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Linda's always been the strong one in our marriage. I handle the practical stuff, but she handles everything else. How am I supposed to take care of her when I don't even know how to take care of myself?" It was a raw, honest admission from a man who'd built his identity around being competent and in control. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "We're your neighbors. That means something." Over the following months, our street came together to support the Richardsons in ways that surprised everyone, including Dave. Sarah, with her nursing background, helped coordinate Linda's medical appointments and medications. I took care of their yard work and basic home maintenance. Other neighbors organized meal trains and transportation to chemotherapy sessions. Dave was overwhelmed by the response, but he was also confused by it. "I don't understand why everyone is being so generous," he said one afternoon as we loaded Linda's wheelchair into his car for a doctor's appointment. "I wasn't particularly friendly to anyone when we first moved here." "That was then," I said. "This is now. People judge you by who you are today, not who you were 2 years ago." "But I called the police on you multiple times," Dave pointed out. "I was a terrible neighbor." "Yeah, you were," I agreed. "But then you figured out how to be a better neighbor. That's what people remember." Linda's treatment was successful, and by late spring she was declared cancer-free. The experience had changed both of the Richardsons, but it had especially changed Dave's understanding of what community meant. He'd learned that being part of a neighborhood wasn't about managing other people or controlling outcomes. It was about showing up for each other when things got difficult. The first anniversary of our property line dispute passed without either of us mentioning it, but I found myself thinking about how different everything might have been if we'd handled that initial conflict differently. If I'd backed down when Dave called the police, he might never have learned that his approach was wrong. If I'd escalated the situation or held a permanent grudge, we might have spent years as enemies instead of neighbors. Instead, we'd found a way to resolve our differences that left room for growth and change. Dave had learned to be a better neighbor, and I'd learned something about the value of standing firm on principle while remaining open to the possibility that even difficult people could improve. On a warm Saturday morning in late May, almost exactly a year after the tree removal, I was working in Sarah's in my small garden when Dave came outside to mow his lawn. We waved to each other, exchanged a few words about the weather and the local baseball team's prospects, and went back to our respective yard work. It was a perfectly ordinary interaction between perfectly ordinary neighbors, and that ordinariness felt like a victory. Not the dramatic kind of victory that comes from winning a fight or proving a point, but the quiet kind that comes from building something sustainable and positive out of conflict and misunderstanding. Later that afternoon, Sarah and I were sitting on our back deck when Dave and Linda came outside to enjoy the beautiful weather. Linda was wearing a colorful scarf to cover her hair, which was still growing back from chemotherapy, but she looked healthy and happy. She waved to us from across the yard. "How are the tomatoes coming along?" she called out. "Great," Sarah called back. "We should have more than we can eat in a few weeks. You'll have to take some home." "That would be wonderful," Linda said. "I'll bring over some of my zucchini bread in exchange." It was the kind of casual conversation that happens between neighbors who genuinely like each other, and it struck me how natural it felt after all the drama and tension of our early relationship. Dave Richardson wasn't the same man who'd called the police on me for trimming trees on my own property. He'd grown and changed and learned to be part of a community instead of trying to control it. But more than that, he'd learned that admitting mistakes and making amends wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign of maturity. And I'd learned that giving people the opportunity to be better than they'd been was usually worth the risk, even when they'd given you plenty of reasons to write them off. As the sun set behind our neighbor's house, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I found myself grateful for the strange way that conflict had brought our community together. The property line dispute had been unpleasant and stressful, but it had also been the beginning of something better, a more honest relationship based on mutual respect rather than mutual avoidance. "You know what I realized today?" I said to Sarah as we watched Dave and Linda go back inside their house. "What's that?" "That property deed I showed the police officer last year, it didn't just prove where my land ended and Dave's began, it proved that I belonged here, that I had the right to stand up for myself, and that I didn't have to accept being pushed around just to keep the peace." "That's a lot of weight to put on one piece of paper," Sarah said. "Maybe, but sometimes you need something concrete to hold on to when people are trying to make you doubt yourself. That deed was proof that I knew what I was talking about, that I'd done my homework, and that I wasn't going to be intimidated by someone who thought he could bully me into submission." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And now? Now, Dave and I are neighbors in the best sense of the word. We help each other out, we respect each other's space, and we've both learned something about what it means to be part of a community." It wasn't a Hollywood ending where former enemies became best friends, but it was something better, a realistic resolution that acknowledged the complexity of human relationships and the possibility for growth and change. Dave Richardson would never be my closest friend, but he'd become a good neighbor, and in a world where people often seemed more interested in winning arguments than solving problems, that felt like a significant achievement. As I locked up the house and turned off the deck lights, I thought about the lessons I'd learned from the whole experience. Standing up for yourself was important, but so was knowing when to extend grace. Having your facts straight mattered, but so did being willing to forgive mistakes. And sometimes the best way to win a conflict was to make sure everyone involved could walk away with their dignity intact. The property deed was back in its fireproof safe, and I hoped I'd never need to use it to prove a point again. But I was glad I'd had it when I needed it, and I was even more glad that Dave Richardson had learned from his mistake rather than doubling down on his error. It had taken almost 2 years, but we'd finally figured out how to be neighbors in the truest sense of the word. And in a country where neighbors increasingly seem to view each other as enemies rather than allies, that felt like something worth celebrating.